There is only one opponent who we know for sure that Zoro is going to fight in the final saga, and that is Dracula Mihawk. But if we break down the remaining enemy organizations that the Straw Hats are set to defeat, as well as the number of arcs that seem to be remaining in the story, it is likely that Zoro will be getting at least 4 other major opponents before the end of One Piece. Now, because Zoro only fights subordinates, it's a lot more difficult to pick out all of his matchups compared to Luffy, considering so many enemy organizations are currently tricky to predict, with new additions such as Cross Guild, internal changes in the Marines, and new enemy reveals among the Celestial Dragons. However, taking into account the current direction of all major factions in the story so far, the most likely roster of enemies remaining for Zoro at this moment in time seems to be Mihawk, Shiryu, Ben Beckman, S-Hawk, and Gorosei Venus Juro. Seems surprising? Well, let me break down why these are the most likely candidates, as well as what a likely order that they will be coming up in. And finally, there is a hidden 6th possibility that I will discuss at the end of this video. So the first opponent that seems most likely for Zoro is Ben Beckman in the Elbaf arc. I explained in my previous video going over Luffy's remaining fights why the red-haired pirates seem to be likely opponents for the Straw Hats in the Elbaf arc. But to quickly summarize the points here, Shanks has made it clear that he is now interested in competing for the One Piece, and he even just took all of Kid's road poneglyphs. It is likely that Shanks is more so interested in testing Luffy, as he had no interest in the One Piece before Luffy became a Yonko, but either way, that does set up a challenge for Luffy on Elbaf. And on Luffy's side of things, he's been talking about how he does want to take on Shanks as well for some time now. I've long believed that Elbaf is perfectly set up for a Davy backfight between the Straw Hats and the red-haired pirates, as it's the perfect way to have the two crews go up against one another in a relatively friendly competition, and it provides the perfect opportunity for Luffy to prove once and for all that he and his crew have surpassed Shanks and the red-haired pirates. Remember, the very first dream that Luffy ever expressed in the entire story was to one day have a crew that's even better than Shanks's. On top of this, there are currently no other opponents for the Straw Hats on Elbaf, and we know that Elbaf is the next arc, making it all the more likely that the red-haired pirates will be the next challenge for the Straw Hats around the corner. And if that's the case, then of course Zoro's matchup would be Ben Beckman, as Ben Beckman is Shanks' right hand and Zoro always faces the number 2 of the opposing faction. If the context is a Davy backfight, then it's possible that Zoro wouldn't fight Ben Beckman in pure 1v1 combat, but either way, we will likely see Zoro going up against Ben Beckman in some manner. And now you might be saying that this is a weird matchup, since Ben Beckman seems to use guns rather than swords, and Zoro tends to only fight swordsmen. However, we recently got a strong hint that Oda may have been hiding Ben Beckman's true fighting style as a swordsman all this time, as it turns out that Ben Beckman was the one who cut off Kid's arm. This doesn't confirm that Beckman is a swordsman, but it certainly makes it a strong possibility. Ben Beckman would also be a great matchup for Zoro coming out of Egghead Island, as many readers seem to believe that Ben Beckman is the strongest of the existing Yonko first mates. So Zoro defeating him would be some excellent progress for Zoro, pushing Zoro past all the other first mates into what many would consider to be verging on quote-unquote top-tier territory in the One Piece world. That seems like logical progression for Zoro, as he continues to climb to become strong enough to defeat Mihawk sooner than later. Now after Ben Beckman, I believe the next most likely opponent would be Shiryu in the Laugh Tale arc. Now look, I personally do not find Shiryu to be an impressive fighter so far. It is hard for me to even believe that he's stronger than King at this point, considering how pathetic Shiryu's contribution was in the Garp fight. Shiryu got in one sneak attack while Garp was handling the entire Blackbeard pirates and Aokiji at once, and then Shiryu was immediately made irrelevant after that. There just seems to be a clear gap between Shiryu and the top tier characters of One Piece. So for Shiryu to be one of Zoro's final opponents when Zoro needs to become a top tier character himself soon seems a little off. However, there is one major factor to consider with Shiryu, which is that perhaps the entire point is that Shiryu is not as strong of a direct fighter as you might expect, but rather is meant to pose an entirely different type of challenge. One of the major staples of the Blackbeard pirates is precisely the fact that they don't play fair. I wouldn't be surprised if Shiryu is not as strong of a swordsman as Zoro, but rather Shiryu's invisibility fruit is the main problem that Zoro will have to overcome. Since Zoro is a relatively straightforward fighter who prefers a direct, honorable challenge, we have seen many times in the story that he can struggle more than he should when he has to deal with trickery or unfair fighting styles. From Kabaji's cheap tricks all the way back in Orangetown, to Pika's disappearing body in Dressrosa, Over the course of the series, these are the types of matchups that Zoro particularly dislikes. As such, someone like Shiryu is probably the perfect opportunity to force Zoro to have to grow as a swordsman. Because while Zoro has made great strides in armament and conqueror's haki, he has never been shown to be anything special in observation haki. If Zoro is going to defeat Mihawk, who himself is likely extremely proficient at all three types of haki, then it would be fitting for Zoro to get a challenge like Shiryu that would force Zoro out of his comfort zone to advance his observation haki to the level befitting the world's strongest swordsman. As such, I definitely think that Shiryu is a necessary step for Zoro in the path to World's Strongest, and Shiryu is of course a practically guaranteed fight when the Straw Hats go up against the Blackbeard Pirates. And this is a matchup that I would expect to take place in the Laugh-Tale arc if we had to take a guess, as that is when the final competition for the One Piece would likely occur. And if you're enjoying this video so far, make sure to subscribe, and make sure to get your stylish One Piece inspired clothing. We have subtle designs like Fruit of the Devil and Haki that can be worn anywhere, and they come in t-shirts, sweatshirts, and now even as hoodies. So make sure to order yours by hitting the link to the Morge store below. And make sure to get your one-of-a-kind One Piece puzzle featuring all of the major characters, also now available in the Morge store. So that aside, you might now be asking, when does Mihawk come up? When is Zoro's fated matchup with Mihawk? This is actually the most difficult question to answer, so I'm saving that for a few more spots down the line. First, we need to talk about S-Hawk instead. And I believe that he will be fought in the final war. Okay, so this is probably the most difficult matchup to explain, but it has a very high possibility when you think about it. To begin with, the final war against the world government would naturally involve going up against the Marines. While the Celestial Dragons are the final villains, they can't be dealt with without also defeating the Marines first. And it seems to make sense that the Marines would be phase 1 of the conflict, while the Celestial Dragons would be phase 2. We can even see this sort of natural progression in miniature in Egghead Island itself, where the Marines are the first force that the Straw Hats are having to deal with, and then Celestial Dragon Saturn turns out to be the final boss of the arc. There is a lot more that I go into in this video explaining why it is very likely that the Straw Hats will end up having to fight the Marines first in the final war, and in particular why Luffy versus Akainu is a natural matchup that seems to have been foreshadowed from far, far back in the story, with it being both necessary symbolically for what they both represent, and for both of their individual character storylines. However, the problem that then comes with this is, who do the rest of the Straw Hats fight in this case? Because the one issue with Akainu is that he's actually running out of subordinates fast. See, a long-time theory was that we would one day get to see each of the monster trio against the admirals, with Luffy fighting Fleet Admiral Akainu, and Zoro and Sanji taking on two admirals themselves. However, it seems that Oda is doing something far, far more interesting with the Marines. Rather than writing them as a generic militia that needs to be defeated, we are now delving into the moral qualms that the Marines have to face, with potential for defection and changing sides becoming increasingly more likely. Sword's entire existence suggests that Oda is writing a major shift for many of the Marines' allegiances. We've already seen Aokiji quit. Fujitora is basically guaranteed to turn against the Marines by the final war, as everything he stands for in Dressrosa and his actions throughout the Reverie make it pretty much absurd to think that Fujitora would stand on the side of genocide, slavery, and oppression in the final battle. And now even Kizaru, Akainu's longtime ally, his go-to guy, even he seems to be going through a moral dilemma this arc, and he is turning out to be much more of a nuanced character than we would have expected, with an extremely strong chance of a character arc that turns him away from the dark side as well, as I elaborate on in this video. So at the end of the day, who are we even looking at as Akainu's top subordinates? Green Bull? Is that it? Well, that's why I personally believe that this is the point where the Seraphim come in. The Seraphim almost have to play a major role in the story, as pretty much the entirety of the New World was building up to their reveal. All of the scientific advancements and projects that we slowly learned about, cloning, artificial devil fruits, bloodline elements, gigantification, all of it was finally brought to fruition in one singular creation that represents the culmination of scientific progress: the ultimate weapons, the Seraphim. Vegapunk, who is quite literally the most knowledgeable person in the entire world, believes that they are the ultimate beings, and they were created very specifically to be military weapons, the replacement for the Shichibukai. Now, walking back a bit, in the first place, the Shichibukai and the Marines were supposed to be a dual military force. In theory, you line up the admirals and the Shichibukai together and you can crush any Yonko crew. That was the idea presented at the start of the Marineford battle. The admirals and the Shichibukai are are also usually referenced together as military assets. The problem, of course, was that the Shichibukai don't listen, so they were unreliable. But see, now with the Seraphim, we have versions of the Shichibukai that technically have to listen. If the Marines are currently losing so many top-level fighters because of this tricky thing called human nature and free will, then isn't that the entire point of bringing the Seraphim into the story right now, so that there will actually be some powerful replacement assets for the Marines in the final war? Two major points that seem to suggest that this is likely to me is that 1. The Seraphim were never actually defeated in Egghead Island, they were just put into bubbles. Oda doesn't seem to want to have a climactic battle against the Seraphim just yet, he's just stalling them and seemingly saving them for later. And 2, it's been made clear that the Seraphim we are seeing right now are just a preview of their true potential. Right now they are literally just children, and yet they have already posed a decent challenge to 2 Yonkos, a Yonko First Mate, and CP0's best fighters. At full power, in adult form, the Seraphim genuinely have the potential to be top-tier characters, as Vegapunk explicitly designed them to be. So, you have a set of military assets that are meant to be used by the Marines, who are designed to turn into top-tier threats at a time that the Marines are losing their current top-tier fighters. And Oda is deliberately leaving the Seraphim thread currently unresolved at the moment, and hasn't actually had anyone defeat them, only temporarily stalled them instead. I wouldn't be surprised if we will be seeing the Seraphim on the Marine side in the final war, in which case at that point, S-Hawk would likely be the strongest subordinate that Akainu has, with nearly every admiral defected by that point. So who better for one of Zoro's final opponents than the ultimate Frankenstein monster of all of Zoro's strongest opponents fused together? Mihawk's DNA plus King's Lunarian abilities plus Mr. One's Devil Fruit, and gigantification to top it all off. I can't think of a better use for S-Hawk than to be one of Zoro's final opponents, and there desperately needs to be a strong opponent for Zoro once it comes time to fight the Marines. However, the Marines are not the end-all be-all. Above even them, we have Imu and the Gorosei, and here a simple final option for a Zoro opponent presents itself: Gorosei Venus Juro at the end of the final war. He is the only Gorosei member that is clearly a swordsman, and he seems to wield one of the most legendary blades in existence, the Shodai Kitetsu. As a fellow Kitetsu owner, it seems like Venus Juro and Zoro fighting is a natural matchup. The Gorosei are also Imu's direct and most important subordinates, and if Luffy is fighting Imu, then it's only natural for Zoro to fight one of Imu's top subordinates, as he always does. The Gorosei themselves are obviously extremely strong, considering they seem to have been around for many lifespans, are potentially immortal, have exceptionally powerful mythical zoans, and have ridiculously strong haki, considering Saturn was exuding tremendous amounts of black lightning that was visible even from a distance, just from his mere presence, which is something that no other character in One Piece has done. Safe to say, fighting a Gorosei, maybe even the strongest Gorosei, would certainly be a fitting final matchup for Zoro. And finally, that brings us to Mihawk. This is really weird, as Mihawk is Zoro's most definitive matchup of all the characters, and yet he is also the most difficult to place in the timeline. When does Zoro fight Mihawk? In what context? Now let's get this out of the way first. I've seen some people argue that Zoro will fight Mihawk after the final war, after everything else has been resolved, as the final battle of One Piece. This makes no sense, as this is not Zoro Piece. There is absolutely no way that all of One Piece concludes with an epic final battle for Zoro to become the world's strongest swordsman. It would be just an absolutely bizarre ending, with the giant final war concluding, the Celestial Dragons being defeated, Luffy bringing the dawn, fulfilling the will of D, creating a new world, and then cutting to the actual final battle of Zoro just dueling Mihawk for some personal title? That's the actual final battle? It was about Zoro all along? I cannot imagine that happening at all. I've seen some people argue that it would just be an epilogue, but no, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what an epilogue is. An epilogue is never a grand, dramatic final battle with major character moments. That would make it a part of the climax. An epilogue is just the post-action section of the story that quietly ties together loose ends, with maybe some final subtle closing character moments written in. There is no story that has a grand, epic battle with a huge character arc being concluded in an epilogue. That's not a thing. Now, if you think that Zoro vs Mihawk will be a very brief battle that we just get to see a glimpse of, maybe just a couple throwaway panels to establish that it happened and that Zoro became the world's strongest swordsman, then sure, that's something that could get thrown into an epilogue. But in that case, I think the bigger problem is that we would all be very disappointed that the most hyped sword duel in the entire series was relegated to a very brief, insignificant snippet. So you can't have it both ways. Either Zoro versus Mihawk happens in the epilogue, in which case it would be a very small, brief snippet of it, which would be very disappointing, or it is the grand, dramatic battle that we all want that spans multiple chapters, but then it very obviously can't be the giant, final, concluding battle of all of One Piece, since this isn't Zoro's story. I personally prefer to believe that Zoro vs Mihawk will be a grand, dramatic battle, in which case it very obviously will not be the final battle of the story, it will not be the climax of One Piece, so it has to come somewhere earlier. And since Mihawk won't be on the Celestial Dragon side in the final war, that means that the Zoro vs Mihawk duel has to go somewhere before the war against the Celestial Dragons. Mihawk is now tied to Cross Guild, so I guess the bigger question is, when do the Straw Hats fight Cross Guild? That in itself is almost impossible to answer, since Cross Guild has no opponent for Luffy. Buggy is not a real matchup for Luffy, so it's not as easy to guess when and how Cross Guild will come into play against the Straw Hats, as we can't tell where they would make sense as an obstacle in Luffy's journey. Whereas Shanks and Elbaf, then Blackbeard and Laugh-Tale, and then Akainu and Imu in the final war seems like a natural progression for Luffy and the Straw Hats, there is no clear place to slot Buggy and Cross Guild. Therefore, there is no clear place to slot Zoro vs Mihawk. I genuinely don't have a good guess, since Cross Guild is the real wildcard in the story at this point. All I can say is, I'm confident that Zoro vs Mihawk can't be the final battle of One Piece, so it won't be after the final war, but it also probably won't be before the red-haired pirates. And finally, there is one honorable mention, and that is Kizaru at Egghead Island. I'm mentioning this because I know a lot of fans want to see it happen, myself included, and I do see the possibility. Right now, Luffy seems set to fight Saturn as soon as Luffy can awaken, but in that case, Kizaru would be unoccupied, as I imagine that Kizaru himself can likely get back up soon as well. Now, it's entirely possible that Kizaru will switch sides against Saturn, as I talked about at length in the past, but it's doubtful that it would be an immediate switch. Kizaru was clearly following orders just a few chapters ago. As such, it's possible that Kizaru may need to be stalled by someone in the meantime. Is it possible that Zoro can get past Lucci and keep Kizaru busy for a bit? Some might say that's too difficult for Zoro, but at the same time, Zoro has yet to use his actual trump card, Ashura, which permanently scarred Kaido the only time he used it. With Zoro's newfound Conqueror's Haki mastery, there's a good shot that Ashura would hold up against Kizaru, so that's a fun little possibility to consider for the hardcore Zoro fans. But overall, it looks like Zoro's final roster of opponents seems to be Ben Beckman in Elbaf, Shiryu at Laugh-Tale, S-Hawk in the final war, and Venus Juro as Zoro's final battle. Mihawk remains as this floating, mystery opponent that can slot in nearly anywhere. So let me know in the comments below when you think Zoro will fight Mihawk, and if you enjoyed this video then definitely like and subscribe. And you can get my extended thoughts on some other hidden potential matchups for Zoro on my weekly podcast by supporting me on Patreon, link in the description below. And lastly, don't forget to get your clothing from the Morge store, link in the description below as well.